all so much for coming this evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Symposium on the work of Raghubir Singh, widely acknowledged to be one of India's greatest photographers and a pioneer in 20th century color photography. A magnificent retrospective has just opened at the Met Royal, and I hope many of you will go and see it. It is truly stunning. We're fortunate to have here with us Mia Feynman, sitting in the front row, who curated the exhibition, and Devika Singh, Raghubir's daughter, who worked closely to facilitate the retrospective. So please, another round of applause. In the 1990s, Raghubir was a familiar presence at Columbia, and quite a number of us were privileged to know him and count ourselves as his friends. Raghubir used to come to various talks on campus, among them Arthur Danto's lectures on Clement Greenberg, and he would come away animated by a new energy that informed the bursts of writing he did then about the history and theory of photography. He didn't talk much about his own photos, but he did have a great deal to say about what inspired him as a photographer. One of my most vivid memories was of a conversation in which he talked about how he, as a photographer, instinctively knew when to lift the camera, as he put it, and when he could not. The phrase, lifting the camera, almost appeared as shorthand to the compositional principles by which he made sense of disorder and chaos. His sudden death in April, his work will have their own favorites among the vast corpus of images he produced. Over the course of his career, Raghubir's growing fascination with the conceptual aspects of the image is evident in his use of mirrors, plate glass doors, and car windows, and you can see one such instance of this, to break up the illusion of the unmediated image. But for all the framing devices, such as this, and cinematic snatches of arrested movement, such as this marvelous image and this other absolutely stunning photo, images that he employed to such brilliant effect, he never lost sight of an abiding humanism in the subjects of his photography. He had an empathetic imagination, and his ability to convey the living presence of individuals typically marginalized or forgotten is what makes his craft so special. His crowd scenes are all the more remarkable because he restored individuality to the density of the crowd, as in this absolutely marvelous image. This is a marked contrast to the practice of colonial photographers like Linnaeus Trek, who preferred his images to be empty of people, and he would photograph in the very early hours of the day before the streets were crowded with people and images. This is one of Trike's images, his photo of Tanjavur, which Raghubir also took pictures of. I don't have it in the slideshow here, but if you ever look at his book on Tamil Nadu, you'll see the stark differences between this kind of photography here of Tanjavur and the next one of Madurai, also a site that Raghubir had photographed. And you could see the total contrast of preoccupations. Raghubir's interest was just the opposite of Linnaeus Trike's. Even when he photographed endless vistas, his images are a counterpoint to the colonial photography that emptied the landscape of its people. You can see in this image of a temple. I think, for instance, about his photo of the majestic mingling of the three oceans at Kanyakumari, at the southernmost tip of India. It's the woman whose head insistently intrudes who turns out to be the real center of interest. Raghubir brought to his camera work a humanistic vision of contemporary India, a canvas not of machines and artifacts, though they certainly exist in his frames, but of the human energies that shaped what he was convinced was a uniquely Indian civilization. His pursuit of an Indian point of view in photography found its most radical expression in the use of color, marking his departure from the Western masters of black and white photography he revered, in particular Henri Cartier-Bresson, whose book on Jaipur set Raghubir on the path to becoming a photographer. He writes about meeting Cartier-Bresson and presenting him with his first two books, only to see his idol flip through a few pages impatiently and disdainfully put the books aside. Far from being discouraged, Raghubir held even more tenaciously to the idea that color best represented the rhythms and sensory textures of India's pulsating life. Indeed, he came to see color not so much as a medium, but as a cultural practice. In his last book, published a year before his death, River of Color, he offers his most sustained exposition of a civilizational theory of color. In his words, and I quote, "If photography had been an Indian invention, I believe that seeing in color would have never posed the theoretical or artistic problems perceived by Western photographers," unquote. As this remark suggests, he had a much larger ambition in his color photography to give modernism an alternative genealogy that displaced the West as the site of modernist production. In seeking to fashion an Indian aesthetic out of a Western import, i.e. the camera, Raghubir replayed many of the debates that swirled around in intellectual and artistic circles in the Indian national struggle against British colonialism. But unlike the early nationalists, Raghubir refused nativist solutions and instead always sought to find ways of expressing what he described as an Indian sensibility to the experience of modernity. Helping us think through some of the most important questions raised by Raghubir's photography are three distinguished speakers, all of whom knew Raghubir during his lifetime and of course knew his work closely. The presentations this evening will be in reverse alphabetical order, so Rahman will start us off by elaborating on the place of India in Raghubir's work. Ram wears many hats. He is a photographer, curator, activist, designer, and co-founder of the SAHMAT Collective, which is dedicated to promoting cultural pluralism and secularism in India. His interest is in encouraging public art projects so as to take art to the masses, especially in the rural areas of India. He studied physics at MIT and then went on to study graphic design at the Yale University School of Art. His most recent publication is Sunil Jana Photographs, 1940 to 1950. So I welcome Ram to come to the podium to speak about Raghubir.
Thank you, Gauri, for organizing this talk on the occasion of Raghubir's exhibition. And thank you, Akhil, for also helping initiate it. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to start with a slightly personal note, but what I'm going to do this evening is place Raghubir and his practice in the context of Indian photography at the time that Raghubir started making his pictures, and to show, how he evolved in a very unique way, quite separate from most of the other photographers who were working in India at the time. This picture that you see above has kind of become an iconic image of Raghubir. It was shot in 1982. I'd actually met Raghubir in New York, and oddly, Gauri and I and Columbia and Raghubir have a history going back to December 6th, 1993, which was the first, I see Jack Hawley sitting there, who was the troublemaker who caused that evening. It was the first anniversary of the demolition of the Babri Mosque, which had happened in 1992, and SAHMAT had produced an exhibition on the city of Ayodhya. And Jack had organized a symposium at Columbia, and Gauri was on the podium with me, along with Vidya Deheja, as I remember. I don't think Vidya's here just now. And we were assaulted by a group of RSS people in the audience who questioned my name, Ram being a Hindu name and Rahman being a Muslim name. That how can you have a name like that, and how can you speak on the Ramayana? And there was a kind of assault. We were on a similar height, and Raghubir was staying with us, and he had a Nikon camera which is very sturdy and has a pretty solid base. And he was assaulting these people on their heads with his camera. That was 24 years ago. I hope we are not assaulted this evening. I actually met Raghubir in an odd circumstance in 1981. The Museum of Modern Art had done a very large retrospective of the filmmaker Satyajit Ray, who was a big influence on Raghubir. And Ray had come to New York with Chidananda Dasgupta, who was a critic, and Bansi Chandragupta, who was his great set designer and set decorator, and worked with him on all his great films through the mid-1960s. Bansi had never left India before. My roommate Zeti was working in the MoMA film department specifically for this festival. And Bansi unfortunately died of a massive heart attack in New York. And it was a very horrible event. Bansi's suitcase was lying in my parents' apartment on 56th Street. And they opened it and found his diary, because we were trying to collect people who knew Bansi for the funeral. And I found Raghubir's number in the diary. It was a number in Brooklyn. And it happened to be the number of William Gedney, the photographer, whom he was staying with. So I called Raghubir and introduced myself and said, I'm calling you for something very sad. And he came to the funeral, which was on the Upper West Side over here. And that's when we met and went for coffee after. So it was an odd meeting, and became a friendship and relationship which lasted many years. Tom Roma is not here as yet. We were hoping he would. Actually, he teaches at Columbia, but Tom was going off to Italy to produce Lee Friedlander's new book. This is actually shot in Tom Roma's house. It's Raghubir and the photographer Lois Connor doing the hula hoop. This is in Brooklyn. Some few quick snapshots. That's Raghubir's opening many years ago with Lee Friedlander and Anna, his daughter, at Aperture, where they used to be on 23rd Street. And that's Max, Kozloff, and Raghubir at a Halloween party in our loft. Max, you better turn around. Yeah. And I think this is 1990, and on the couch in the back is Maria Friedlander. These are pictures by William Gedney, and I'll be speaking a bit about Gedney. These are taken sometime in the 70s in Paris. That's Raghubir, and I'm pretty sure that's his mother-in-law's flat. It is? Devika? Yeah. He kind of looks like what I used to look like, actually, at that stage of my life. And another one with Anne. One of the few times I've ever seen Raghubir in a kurta, actually, and not in a Lacoste shirt. Raghubir came from Jaipur, and he came from a Rajput feudal landed gentry family, but it was not a particularly artistic or intellectual family. So he had no art background growing up and going to school, but he was doing photography as a student in his school, St. Xavier's. When he went to Delhi University, he met a group of students who were quite left-wing and became lifelong friends of his at Hindu College in the 1960s. Went off to Bengal, to Calcutta, to try and get a job in the tea estates, and he was not successful. A brother had given him a camera and he decided that he would start photographing. In Jaipur, he photographed a riot, which happened, I think, in 1967. And if you see the show at the Met Broyer, there's a New York Times Sunday magazine from that time, which has his pictures on the cover. That was his beginning of his photojournalist career. Raghubir also met Stuart Cary Welch, the great Mughal miniature art historian who taught in Harvard and became the head of the Department of Islamic Art at the Met, and happens to be both Glenn's guru and my guru. I was doing physics, but I did classes with Cary in Harvard. This was an important connection for Raghubir, and not to be deprecating, but I always called Raghubir a provincial intellectual, because he came from Jaipur, which didn't have a intense intellectual tradition, but Raghubir became a self-taught intellectual. He had never studied art history. He was studying English. He was studying history at Hindu College. But the connection with Cary, and then a little bit later with Satyajit Ray in Calcutta, really gave him access to two different aspects of a cultural education. Calcutta at that time was still a kind of intellectual hotbed. It was the last gasp of the intellectual Bengal Renaissance, and Ray was really the last great figure of that at the time. And he had seen Raghubir's early work and had been disparaging, which Raghubir became aware of. But every time Raghubir got a criticism, he would react to it by internalizing it, understanding it, and making work which would transcend that criticism, especially to that person. He became very close to Ray. This is an early picture. This is from the catalogue, actually, which Mia has edited. This is an early picture from Calcutta when he was doing essentially photojournalistic work, which was not very different from what many other photographers would have been doing. He was making work for National Geographic at the time. He was shooting in color because National Geographic required color. A number of the European American magazines also liked color for their features. He was also shooting quite traditionally with long lenses in a very photojournalistic manner, as you'll see here. 1969, he met William Gedney, who was an American photographer based in New York. And Gedney was a photographer's photographer. He was part of the New York street photography tradition, which had really exploded in the 1950s, very close to much better known photographers like Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, Helen Levitt, etc. He was part of that group, but had never promoted himself. He was very reticent, he was quiet, deeply intellectual, very interested in the history of photography. This was the kind of photography that Gedney was doing in India. And what he did was he took that aesthetic of the street photograph, 35mm, wide to normal lens, fixed lens, using the full frame. It had become a kind of game to capture the street with its vibrance, except by going to India, Gedney, immerses himself in a completely different culture, which was visually, of course, completely different from New York City. But the distinction with Gedney was that he was, he had an amazing eye, and he was very focused on the person, on people. And his pictures are filled with these wonderful human interactions. And they're not Orientalist in the sense that many photographers would look at exotic India. Gedney, of course, was photographing in black and white, as were many of these other photographers, except for Helen Levitt. So you saw that earlier picture of Raghubir's, this one. Gedney becomes a big influence because he opens Raghubir's eyes to a different world of photographic thinking, except, of course, the distinction being that Raghubir is working in color. And as Gauri mentioned earlier, color became his métier, and he, felt that you could not photograph in India if you didn't photograph in color. That color was part of the life of India and completely rooted in our culture. So this is the kind of picture that he starts to make with the complexity of the 35mm frame. Partly deriving from a tradition that Cartier-Bresson had started, particularly with his India pictures, which were very familiar to Indian photographers. And the distinction here is that Raghubir is working in a photojournalist milieu with people like Raghu Rai, Raghu's brother S. Paul, who just passed away a few weeks ago, Kishore Parekh, who were all solid photojournalists. There were very few people who were looking at photography as a creative medium in itself. And because of Raghubir's connections with Carey and with Ray, he had become much more interested in other aspects of art and art history, and became a voracious reader and researcher, and steeped in the history of photography. The other great advantage that Raghubir had was that he met Anne in Southeast Asia and married her in Hong Kong. And they moved to Paris, and the advantage was that he had one foot in the West, and it mattered importantly because he was using color, which was very difficult to use in India. The film was very expensive. Cameras were very hard to get. After independence, we had very limited foreign exchange, and there were import duties on film and cameras. So it was not a mass medium at all. There were few press photographers who could acquire cameras. So with Raghubir's foot in Paris and with his work with the National Geographic, who gave him film, Kodachrome, which could be processed in the US, it wasn't processed in India. That was actually why he could be a color photographer, and he used it to his great advantage. I'm showing you some quick pictures by Gedney, and the reason I'm showing you this is Holi in Banaras, and you see that very large phallus, stuffed phallus in the crotch of that man. And if you look at their eyes, they're all blasted out of their minds. and alcohol. And these are on the street. And the reason I'm showing you this is because Raghubir took me to Gedney's house in Brooklyn and showed me these pictures, and he said that, you know, I want to make those pictures, but I want to make them in color. His whole thing was that I'm going to show these black and white people that I can make a better picture in color. But he never found those situations ever again in Banaras. But he did. This is his holy picture, which is from Bombay. But he was very conscious of these links in photography. You know, he was constantly referring to earlier work or colleagues' work, and always actually in a quite competitive way. This is a picture from Kashmir. Gauri talked about how he, you know, was very steeped in looking at Indian tradition, Indian painting. And this picture has a very direct reference actually to Mughal miniature painting, which is the famous drawing of the dying Inayat Khan, which is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And this picture, both Raghubir and I, and I'm sure Glenn, knew because of Carrie Welch, who spoke about it with great passion in his lectures. And really the connection with Mughal painting for Raghubir was the fact that the Mughals were really the first Indian patrons or rulers who were extremely concerned about a very accurate portraiture of either the emperors or ordinary people or nobles in the court. And you can actually follow figures in Mughal painting from youth to death. In fact, the Inayat Khan, there's some wonderful paintings of the younger Inayat Khan at the Met before he becomes a drug addict and dies. This is from about 1618, commissioned by Jahangir. And that's a color one which is in the Bodleian in Oxford, possibly done by two different artists. Researching, looking for these pictures yesterday, I found in the library this book, and I opened it. It happened to have belonged to Raghubir. So it's quite a strange coincidence. This was a book done by Vidya Deheja for the Festival of India, I think in 1986. And it shows his deep immersion in looking at art history. And this is just a picture from Ahmedabad. And without making too direct comparisons, I mean, the Inayat Khan is a fairly direct one, but it's a case of a photographer who sees something and he remembers a painting that he's seen or a sculpture that he's seen, and he, captures that with delight. That, this is a reference to that, and this is me making a contemporary take on that, linking to that. So a picture like this also has that kind of air, and I'm going to show you a Kota painting from Rajasthan with the kind of play of overhead looking. Now this is not to say that he's trying to make a picture which looks like this, but he's certainly very aware of this kind of painting construction and color, and he's playing with that, with delight actually. Gedney's other big influence was, Gedney was making pictures of the middle class or the upper middle class, which was not really a subject, certainly for photojournalists in India. These were in Calcutta. And I have not recognized this lady, but she's definitely, is this R.P. Gupta's wife? And this kind of a picture with this lady smoking, with her maid, obviously the help in the house, was a very unusual picture to be made in 1969 or 1979. And it kind of opened the door to something that Raghubir worked on extensively, particularly in his later books, looking at the middle class and the upper middle class. A picture like this, which is from Calcutta, which is in a home quite decrepit, but it's a upper middle class home in Calcutta on the left side. On the right, you see the maids, the workers, the help. His pictures, by the way, are filled with information like that about class structure. So they're not just visual games, but you really have to know that to be able to read what the layers are in many of his pictures. Similarly, this, which is from the palace in Lowry in Gujarat. Now, this is an Art Deco building, and you see that spectacular Art Deco furniture and that clock, what I assume to be a clock. But down there are these two maids again. And this picture really, besides being a visual delight, really is talking about the irony of here are these workers in this very incongruous Art Deco setting in the middle of Gujarat. This is something which is coming completely from outside, being brought by a moneyed patron. But here are these maids wearing saris which are almost Matisse-like. And so these pictures are really filled with wonders like that. And you will notice that, that particularly women who are not from the upper classes, dressed in the most extravagant and fabulous ways in India. And that actually has a class distinction. You get some wild outfits, and this is something he was very conscious of. His last book, which is one of my favorite, was on the ambassador car and looking at India through the car. And again, this had, the ambassador was an incongruous British motor which from the 1950s, which was built for 35 years in India. It became the car of India. It carried, our population across the whole of India. And he began to realize, because he hired these taxis when he was making his work, he began to realize that the car was appearing in many of his pictures. And once he became conscious of that, it became a means of his to construct this whole vision of India through the car and with the car. But this picture also has the charpai in the front. It's very formal, it's totally frontal, and this is, it's speaking about that bed, that charpai which is going to vanish. It was a handmade, handcrafted people's object. In the back you have this industrial object, and now you will not see the ambassador in India any longer, and you hardly see any charpais in India. The influence of someone like Lee Friedlander. He's looking at all these people, but he's defying them, and they all used to tease Raghubir about working in color, saying, you can't be serious. Color is just not serious. Come on, make some serious pictures. But he was defying them, but using elements that Lee would use, breaking the frame, odd elements, signs, street poles coming in. And this, of course, is this amazing image of Gandhi with a serpent, almost like Krishna behind him, but completely fragmented by these completely modernist elements in ways of looking. And this was Raghubir's way of making that dent in Indian photography. Oops. Sorry, I thought there was one more picture, but I guess not. That's it. Thank you. I was going to end with the color picture I made, which was a kind of tribute. But I guess it didn't come on this. Thanks.
I will introduce Glenn here. our next speaker, Dr. Glenn Lowry, who has been director of the Museum of Modern Art since 1995. He came to MoMA as a renowned specialist in Islamic art. He received a BA from Williams College and MA and PhD degrees in the history of art from Harvard University, and he's been awarded honorary degrees from the College of William and Mary and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He has lectured and written extensively in support of contemporary art and artists and the role of museums in society. His recent publications include Designing the New Museum of Modern Art, Oil and Sugar, Contemporary Art and Islamic Culture, and the Museum of Modern Art in the Century. So Glenn, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm the amuse-bouche, or maybe the palate cleanser between Ram and Max. And what I thought I would do is share with you a few observations based on the pleasure I got from knowing Raghubir. And there's little left to be said, actually, because Ram's wonderful talk covered so much of what I think is important about Raghubir's work and life. And Mia's extraordinarily beautiful exhibition, moving exhibition, gives you a real sense in real time and in real space about the critical issues that Raghubir looked at and thought about in his own work. But I got to know Raghubir as a graduate student working for Carrie Welch at Harvard, and in fact I met him by complete accident. Carrie, who didn't know Raghubir, had invited Raghubir to come up to his office and look at miniature paintings, and then realized that he had double booked himself, or maybe triple booked himself, and he turned to me in desperation and said, "I have this Indian friend who's coming, just show him some paintings." So this was in 1977 or early 1978. And so Raghubir appeared, and I had no idea who he was or what he did, other than the fact that Carrie had said, "Well, he's a photographer." So up we went to the office in the Fogg Museum, and there were these shelves full of Indian miniature paintings, some of them from the Harvard collection, but mostly from Carrie's own personal collection. And all we did that afternoon, and it went on for hours, was pull one painting out after another and look at it and talk about it. And it was very clear that Raghubir had this extraordinarily informed eye and knowledge about all of the various traditions of Indian miniature painting. So Ram mentioned mobile painting, mobile drawing, Rajput painting. All of that was part of a mental vocabulary of Raghubir's, learned in part by having grown up in Jaipur, but I think he was a genuine autodidact and intellectual. He absorbed information like a sponge, and he was hypercritical. And I think what hasn't come through yet, but maybe I can flavor a little bit, is Raghubir was a deeply opinionated man with a thin, prickly skin who was willing to get into an argument at a moment's notice. And I think that's a very important part of who he was and why photography was so important and critical to him. He could easily have been a great writer, and all you have to do is read his various introductions to realize how fluidly and thoughtfully he wrote. But he chose photography almost as a weapon to arm himself with in a quest to show a certain kind of Indian. I want to come back to that in a moment, but before I do, I want to make another kind of elision. So I got to know Raghubir on his relatively frequent visits to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at one point he said to me, "Well, if you're ever in Paris, come and visit, and you can stay with us." The us being some ambiguous notion of family, because at that point I didn't realize that he was married to Anne Henning, and that he had just had this remarkable daughter, Devika, who's here with us tonight. But what I took away, and I took him up on that, being a poor graduate student, the idea of staying in a nice apartment in Paris, being a flea-bitten hotel somewhere in banlieue. So I actually started visiting Raghubir with some frequency because I was doing a lot of research in libraries in Paris. And what doesn't become immediately evident, I think, in Raghubir's photographs, and certainly not immediately evident in his most productive output, the many books that he produced, is Anne's role, and certainly her role in the late 70s and 80s. So Raghubir, what I remember vividly is being in the apartment, which was also Raghubir's studio office, and Raghubir was always working on a book, endlessly, and books were a passion of his, in assembling the images in a sequence, organizing them, editing them, refining them, was an obsession. And certainly in the very late 70s and 80s, Anne was not only an interlocutor in that process, but I think actually a critical voice. In a way, her photographs, if you don't know them, especially from the 60s and 70s, are exceedingly tough, in a way even tougher than Raghubir's early photographs of India. And I think she was a built-in critic who helped Raghubir enormously in those first books to clarify what he wanted to say. And for me, at least, there's a dialogue there in the late 70s between Raghubir in a very clear idea of where he wanted to go, and Anne with a very clear sense of how to edit down, how to refine, how to peel things away. In Raghubir's books are visual poems. They're often accompanied by either his or someone else's eloquent and elegant text. But you don't actually need those texts. You just need to look at them to understand that Raghubir not only looked at Indian miniature painting, but he looked at Indian manuscripts and the narrative structure of one image relating to another, a story being told. His books are not a record of an event, they're not a record of a trip, they are a narration of that trip. They are fundamentally about stories he wanted to tell. And so in this context, it seems to me that there are two arguments that could be made, and Max will no doubt pick those apart quickly, but rightly so. But I don't think the issue of color in Raghubir's photography is at all interesting. Raghubir had no choice. He could only have been a color photographer. It's only interesting in the narrow frame of Western prejudices about the significance of color. We build this infrastructure on whether or not color is important, whether or not it's serious. It's nonsense. It's our problem. It was not really Raghubir's problem, although he was deeply versed in all of the arguments about North American and European photography. He wanted to be understood as a major photographer, a modernist to be shown at the Museum of Modern Art, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But to my mind, we made a mountain out of a molehill. That Raghubir had no choice but to work in color, because color was the language of India. In a way, the black and white photography of European or American photographers who go to India is the misguided photography. It's the photography that misses the essence of India, that imposes on India a Western structure and a Western modality of seeing, as opposed to what Raghubir was trying to do. So for me, I want to try and put out there something to debate and argue that the issue of color photography is a Western problem. It is not a subcontinental problem, and it isn't Raghubir's problem at the end of the day. And I want to make a further argument, just to get things going, that I think you have to look at Raghubir's project to show India against the context of the late 1960s and 70s, with Beatlemania that made India and gurus suddenly fashionable and chic, with hippies running off to trips in India, to meditate in the Himalayas, to smoke weed, to in a way, the kind of exoticized, romanticized India that had begun, certainly for my generation, to be the India that we knew, and that so many people went to find. Raghubir's project was to show a very different India in reaction to that. A very conscious effort to show that India was more complicated, more sophisticated, more nuanced, and definitely deeper than the popularized idea of India that had intrigued so many in the West. So even in his early National Geographic images, which are in some ways the most iconic, heroic, maybe one could even argue easily accessible of Raghubir's images, there's always something else going on beside the obvious, whether it's the women's, those three women caught in the monsoon, which are a story not only about the monsoon and regeneration, but they're a story about the land and poverty and who owns it and where do they come from and why are they there. And so I think we need to think about Raghubir's project about India in some larger context about trying to tell a different story of India from the one that was familiar at that time. And in that way, it's also important to realize that Raghubir is a very unusual Indian, and I put that in quotation marks, because he spent the majority of his life not living in India. He wasn't necessarily diasporic in the sense that we would define that word, but I think Raghubir was a fundamental nomad. Somebody who wasn't actually comfortable anywhere for a long period of time. And I just remember conversations with him, and then suddenly he's gone. And of course, India was his subject. Yes, he photographed outside of India, although I argue those images are not in the same order of magnitude. They don't register in the same way that his photographs of India register in terms of impact and importance. But what he really, so India was a place to go to and to photograph, a place to extract information from, a place to explain to himself and to others. But he was a nomad. He was a man who needed to be many different places and no place for a long period of time. And I think that's an important aspect of trying to understand how he keeps having to return to India to refresh himself and to find something new and exciting and important. And so in that way, I wonder whether or not the notion that cultural theorists like Homi Bhabha talk about in terms of the disjunctive moment, that moment of anxiety, of the split frame, of being in between, doesn't also apply to a degree to Raghubir's work. That for all of the seductive beauty of many of his images, and they are seductive and beautiful, and it doesn't take more than a nanosecond in the exhibition that Mia has so beautifully curated to realize how beautiful these images are, to also realize they're fraught with anxiety, that they are not comfortable images. So to just take the image you ended on, those two women in their saris, clearly cleaning. That is an image not just about class. That is an image about, I think, awkwardness and anxiety and power relationships and how those are negotiated. And I think Raghubir was acutely aware of those and wanted to crack them apart. And that a lot of his work exists in between what you see and what you feel. Right? There's a kind of emotional charge to Raghubir's work that operates below and in a way beyond the register of the purely formal and visual. And he was a master of the formal. He understood all of the tropes of Western photography, and actually all of the tropes of colonial Indian photography, and used them whenever he chose to, although he wasn't, I don't think, ever bound by them. But underneath those tropes, underneath those conventions, I think, is the anxiety of dislocation. And it's the anxiety, I think, of someone who is nomadic, for whom India is his subject but not his home. And in that tension between having to be in India, having to photograph it, and also recognizing that he couldn't live there and didn't live there, and therefore was both an insider and an outsider, he allows us, because he sets out to do that, he allows us to see the stereotype And that's why I think he was so consciously aware of that post-Beatles fascination with India. He allows us to see that stereotype, but never creates the stereotype. It's always undermining any notion of the stereotype India by showing and revealing its frailty, its anxiety, its disjunctive moment. And so for me, that is Raghubir's greatest achievement. It is not that he worked in color, or that he was ultimately able to find his rightful place as a color photographer in a larger Western canon. It's that he was able to show us an India in the late 20th century that is a real India, that is an India that can be seen and understood in new and different ways, precisely because he could be the observer and the subject simultaneously. Thank you very much.